Hello and welcome to Learning Rewired, the podcast brought to you by Headspring, the joint venture between the Financial Times and IE Business School. I'm Tiago Kivi, and today my guest is Andrew Hill. Andrew Hill is senior business writer at the Financial Times, a highly experienced journalist who's been writing for the FT since 1988.
That's right, yeah.
Yes.
Long time.
So, Andrew, welcome to Learning Rewired.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Of course, you are a very frequent participant and a contributor to the programs that we do at Headspring. You work with a lot of our clients. You've been doing a lot alongside your job as senior business writer. You've been doing a lot of events as well with the FT Live,
That's right.
the FT events division. And I believe you've been exposed to a lot of leadership over your career, a lot of management theory and so on. So today, the conversation is around the state of leadership in 2025.
Okay.
And I wanted to jump in straight away. This year, I believe has been a very interesting year. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from your perspective as an analyst of leadership and management, I believe it's been quite interesting to see what's going on in the world, right? So, from your perspective, where do we stand in terms of leadership today in October 2025? How you've seen in the last year things changing, the pressures on leader, the role models that we're seeing today, and where's that going? Where's that taking leaders?
Well, where do we stand in October 2025? I think, I'm going to dive straight in, we stand very much in the shadow of the leader of the free world, Donald Trump. He is the role model, for good or ill, that I think a lot of other leaders, not just political leaders, are looking to, either because they feel that they can emulate his, in my view, rather old-fashioned kind of 1980s, 1990s command and control approach, transactional approach to leadership, or because they have to fall in line with some of the decisions and some of the leadership that he is showing. And I think that's having I can't say that at this point I detect a major shift in the way in which corporate leaders, business leaders, are running their organizations. But there's definitely a shift in the rhetoric that they're using. They're either muting a lot of the more, if you like, soft leadership elements that were prominent until last year. Clearly, we no longer speak the initials ESG. We don't talk about DEI any longer if you're a leader in any strong public way, particularly if you're an American company, and above all, if you're a company that does business with the US government. So I think that rhetoric has changed. And I think we are probably going to see some elements of leadership that people think I think personally went out of fashion in the early 2000s in the sense of command and control, transactional leadership, I think are going to return, because I think lots of leaders will say, well, now we've got a clear role model, endorsing this type of approach, and let's try it. It's all about the deal. It's about deal making. It's about who has all the cards, to use a classic Trumpian expression. Personally, I think that is a step backwards. But it has brought back to the fore the reality that in some circumstances, in some cases, that command and control approach might be valid and might actually achieve results. And we're talking in a week when the big deal between Israel and Hamas has been forced through by Trump. And that is, by most standards, we don't know whether it will last, and achievement. So there are cases in which that kind of forceful approach, I'm going to play my cards, I'm going to force the hand of the people I'm dealing with, can work.
Yeah. We've seen over the last few years like this approach where leaders tend to be more embracing of the teams, more collaborative, and not so much, as you said, command and control. And often, and I'm sure you've seen this in books and so on, but in the reality of that approach sometimes can be, you need a lot of different voices. You need to give a lot of room to everybody to chip in and so on. And I think that sometimes can impact efficiency, as you say, and this, what you say, this more direct and command and control approach sometimes, as you said, can be efficient. But can it last? That's my question to you. And also considering the needs or the demands that the new generation coming to the workplace, they have a more open mind. They demand different things from leaders. So can the approach really last, or is just like a short burst to achieve quick results, quick wins, which are very important sometimes, but still, I want to see from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think to move away from Trump slightly, I do think that there, as I've said, there's a case for being able to say, okay, now we have to take some firm decisions and press ahead here, for that being part of the armory of tools that a leader needs. And I've argued quite strongly that the key attribute of leaders in a time of extreme volatility, uncertainty, is adaptability, agility it's sometimes called, but the ability to be able to say, okay, I see that at this point I might need to just take charge a little more strongly. So take the pandemic, for example, and take another very successful leader, Jeff Bezos at Amazon. He, at the start of the pandemic, was essentially overseeing the sort of long-range strategy of Amazon. He'd stepped away from the operational leadership, and he was taking these broad strategic view. But when the COVID hit, and this was the case for other chief executives and leaders as well, he took the view that he needed to step in and, be more hands-on. And of course, that was the right approach in the early stages of an unprecedented disruption to business around the world. The difficulty, and this is the difficulty, I think, with command and control, is that once you've taken command and control, everybody else sort of falls away. Okay, we have to listen to the boss here. We're just going to have to follow what he or she says. And then, of course, it becomes difficult to give up again command and control, to hand the power back to your lieutenants and to step back as leaders should do. So I think the trick here is the ability to be able to say, okay, I've taken the helm and now I need to hand it back and revert to being the strategic, collaborative team leader, which is, I think, the style and approach that works best. And as you mentioned, there are lots of people within the workforce now, as demographic change comes through, and younger generations with different demands and different needs come into the workforce who require a different style of leadership, might not respond well to excessive command and control. I mean, there are clearly other business leaders out there who have reached the very top of their profession or their sector, who have those, if you like, Trumpian attributes. I mean, I'm reading an excellent book that's on the shortlist for the F.T. Schroeder's Business Book of the Year this year, The Thinking Machine, about NVIDIA. Jensen Huang, the chief executive of NVIDIA, at least as painted in this book, is an extremely hard-driving leader who really, really pushes his team. And yet he somehow manages to combine that with respect both for his knowledge and skill and engineering ability and his leadership that gets results, as we see from the fact that NVIDIA is one of the most valuable companies in the world now. Perhaps a more nuanced example is Elon Musk, who clearly, in my view, besmirched his reputation by going all in with Doge and the government reorganization at the beginning of this year, but retains a kind of an enormous respect from his employees at Tesla or SpaceX for his engineering ability, his leadership vision, and so on. And yet again, you could say he's in lots of ways another quite commanding, controlling leader. So I think there are exceptions to this collaborative approach, but the main thing I would say to leaders and aspiring leaders out there is that if you can't get the use of all the tools, collaboration, command when you need it, the ability to both withdraw and step in when required, then you're not going to have the full set of tools that you need to be a good leader.
And of course, when we talk about leadership, by almost default, we need to consider as well the people that are being led, right? The people of the organizations. And within that, there are middle managers who sometimes have to deal with those leaders at the top who, as you said, perhaps they might have a more assertive style or a more collaborative style. What is the best way for managers to find a balance? Because obviously they are there. They are the ones receiving the demand from the top leadership. Sometimes that direction is very clear. Sometimes the direction is not so clear. But they are the ones who are responsible for execution of that vision and direction. And what can managers do, or even how organizations can help those managers to do their job well and to ensure that that vision gets achieved, whether that vision was defined by a very assertive leader or not?
Yes. So, well, you rightly say, obviously, that nobody's a leader without followers. So, obviously, if you lose your followers, you can't, by definition, really be a leader. I guess you can be a thought leader or a visionary, but even that requires a followership. But middle managers, I have enormous respect. I've been there, not recently, but in my career, I've managed teams, and I have a lot of respect for the work that managers in the middle of organizations do. I think they are, in lots of respects, they're the kind of muscle tissue that connects the senior leadership with the front line, and therefore they're vital to communicate, as you suggest, the vision and implement the vision that the senior leadership is laying down. So I think they need cultivating and nurturing, and it's a cliche, but communication is one way to do that. There's nothing worse than being a manager in the middle, being asked by your team what's going on, and not knowing enough to be able to keep your team informed. And so I think communication from top to middle and middle to bottom, I'll call it that, but let's say frontline, is one of the vital ways in which you keep your middle management happy and energized. I think the other thing is we've seen, and this is true, for example, of a lot of the top-down programs that were initiated under the bracket of ESG in recent years, that many of those programs founder, when they reach middle management, sometimes called the sort of perma layer, the permafrost of middle management, that just won't accept they have to change the way in which they are behaving. And that's where leadership vision dies, because it never reaches the teams on the front line. It gets sort of trapped in a layer of uncooperative middle managers. But I think there's a lot to be said. I enjoyed a book a few years ago, which kind of made the connection between captains on the field in sports and middle managers. And I thought that was quite a good analogy. You've got people who really have got their hands dirty because they are on the field dealing with the issues that are facing any business, any organization. But they have a sort of captaincy role that is also an element of leadership. I'm a little bit suspicious of the everyone's a leader cliche that sometimes companies trot out. But I think in this case, it's true that, if you're a manager at any layer in the organization, you've got teams. And so therefore you have a sort of captaincy role, an ability to motivate people who work for you.
And just slightly changing the subject, but still in this conversation around middle managers and communications and efficiency, I wanted to bring a little bit the conversation towards AI.
Yes, inevitably. Yes.
Because obviously there have been many people commenting online or reports or articles on the impact that AI will have on the role of middle managers, whether they are necessary or not, whether they are needed in some organizations or not. And you recently wrote a piece, which is very interesting, right? Which questions if human resources actually need humans.
Yeah.
So first, what led you to write that piece, and what are your views on this topic in general?
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated by the HR function and the people who do that, because it seems to me to be a vital part of any organization of any size. And yet at the same time, as HR people will well know, it has a bad reputation. And I knew what would happen in writing about HR, because it happens every time, is that uncharitable FT readers would dive into the comments and start saying, nasty things about the role of HR, which is often depicted as being the kind of tool of senior management rather than an assistant to the ordinary employee. And indeed, that is what happened. And there was quite a lot of commentary underneath that article that suggested that, if there were fewer humans in HR, it wouldn't really matter, because most were essentially not doing what they profess to do. So I was interested in AI and HR because a number of companies had been telling me and colleagues that AI was, in some cases, IBM was the example that was cited in the piece. AI was already carrying out 80% of the work that HR used to do using humans. And most of that was answering the basic questions that people pose. Where is our health policy? Can I apply for this benefit? Where would I go in order to find, our rules on, expenses? Those sorts of questions that might go through to hardworking humans and are essentially repetitive are very easily, I say easily, although, I spoke to people at Johnson & Johnson who'd spent years trying to kind of ensure that their processes were correct before they could do this. But if you've got a set process of dealing with those types of HR questions, you know where the answers are.
Yeah.
It's quite easy then to work AI into the process. And so in a lot of cases, a machine is now answering those questions much more quickly, more easily, and that is liberating, or ought to be liberating, HR people to do more interesting and more complex work. Of course, the danger is that at the top of the organization, where HR is often, I think, wrongly seen as just a pure overhead, there's bound to be somebody holding the purse strings who says, well, hang on, if AI can do 80% of this, why do I need 100% of my humans? let's just have the machine doing more and more. So there is a really interesting balance there, which I also saw as indicative of the challenges faced by the wider organization of how far do you go in handing those powers to the machine, and how many human beings do you then need in the process, and what are they doing, and indeed how are they even trained for it? Because just to finish up, the paradox for HR is that HR is also largely responsible both for the retraining of people within the organization to use and work with AI, and ultimately it will be at the sharp end of telling people, I'm afraid you've lost your job because we're implementing AI. So it's a huge dilemma and challenge facing human resources as companies and organizations go through this vast disruption that AI is causing.
Where do you think they can add value then? If 80% of their work is being done, in some cases, of course, not every case, but in some cases by machine, where can they make the difference?
Well, I think, as I say, there's certainly a role for HR in concentrating more time on the more complex problems that are thrown their way. So, as lots of people I spoke to for that article said, you clearly, I think one of the quotes, I think it was from Laszlo Bock, who used to be head of people at Google, people analytics at Google, said to me, there's a reason why, we still have priests to take confession. You don't, for the most complex and difficult issues, you still want to talk to a human being. And so in that sense, there's a need for people who can make that kind of human connection. And indeed, there are lots of areas where some companies are reluctant to press into, to hand over to the machine when it comes to issues of pay and promotion, benefits. There are clear privacy issues linked to, how much information you want to put there. The real advocates for AI, like IBM, would say, with the right training of the data and use of the data, you can still hand that sort of thing to the machine. But I think there is real value there for human input in a lot of those complex areas. But clearly there's going to have to be some, as there has to be across the workforce, some element of sort of reskilling to see how you work with the machine. And, it seems to me that a department that says that has human in the name, it ought to be at the forefront of working that out.
And of course, you mentioned reskilling, and earlier on, you mentioned adaptability as a big skill to navigate change, navigate the world that we live today. What are the skills you think are necessary for leaders or managers even to be able to navigate change, navigate uncertainty with more clarity?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think as I say, adaptability is key. The thing about the skills that I think and that surveys suggest are going to be needed, such as learning skills and so on, is that these are particularly hard to teach. And indeed, in some respects, I mean, I always ask the question to leaders, you who mention that they want more people with strong learning skills and adaptability and agility and so on. How do you measure that? How do you detect in a candidate they are going to be adaptable? And often it's how did they respond to other challenges and crises that might have created uncertainty or disruption. But it's rather different from saying, do you have the coding skills that we need? Or do you speak the languages that we need for this particular job? So a lot of things are being assessed and taught that are hard to teach and assess. I mean, I think this is in the realm of futurism to some degree, but it is happening, that AI perhaps offers some assistance with this, because it does allow you to simulate quite a lot of scenarios that allow you to test in real time, how somebody would respond in a particular way to an unlikely or unprecedented scenario, a little bit like flight simulation. You can run somebody through a crisis and do some scenario work with candidates. I'm not sure whether that's being used extensively, but it does seem that it has potential. So I think those are key elements. I'm a fan of the idea that people, and this obviously goes against the sort of Trumpian politics of asserting a fact, even if it isn't actually a fact in some cases. But I'm a strong believer that leaders who don't know should say that they don't know, not in a floundering, hopeless way, but as a way of saying, look, here is what I do know. Here are the things that in this uncertain situation we don't know. And that helps enlist the support of those around the leader in working out solutions to perhaps unprecedented situations that a company might be going through. So I think there is a measured way in which leaders ought to admit to a lack of knowledge, lack of certainty, in order to help bring on board those who are themselves worrying about that sort of situation. I've seen research that suggests that does work in a situation of big uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to touch upon decision making as well, because obviously when there's so much uncertainty in the air, and when you have multiple tools as well available, sometimes making decision can be easier or harder. But where do you see leadership when it comes to decision making as a skill? Perhaps, or maybe to reframe this question is decision making still a key skill for leaders? And what is the best way to utilize tools that are available today to make better decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously decisions, I think a lot of leaders come into leadership roles thinking this is just about making decisions. I have to be decisive all the time. And as I've suggested, I think in a situation of uncertainty, sometimes you do need to reflect and say, okay, I need to make sense of this situation, and I need the help of everybody around me to assist with that. But ultimately, the buck stops at the top, and decisions do have to be made. I often cite, and I've cited it at Headspring events before, an interview I did with Stan McChrystal, the American general, who talked about, being constantly, ready to move, not being sort of stuck in an indecisive situation, because that way you are best adapted to the things that are going to come towards you. The analogy I sometimes think of is with the advice from tennis coaches that, you keep moving your legs as you wait for the serve to arrive, even if you don't know where it's going to go, because then your muscles are ready to, to shift to the position that they're needed to meet whatever's going to come at you. And I think that's kind of a useful way of thinking about it. I think if you get stuck into one decision mode, or in a state of indecision, then that can be that can lead to disaster. And clearly, there's a school of thought which I think is legitimate in some cases that says, if you've taken that decision, if it turns out to be wrong, then you can course correct to another decision. But not taking the decision is in itself a choice.
A decision, yeah.
It's a decision.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way of thinking about this.
Yeah. And previously, currently you are a senior business writer at the FT, but obviously you've had many different roles at the FT. And as part of these roles that you had in the past, you were a management editor. And I think one of your I guess, annual tasks was to review a lot of management books.
Yes.
Right. So I wanted to dive in a little bit into that because there are many books out there, about management, about leadership. Which ones stand out to you, and which ones perhaps have stood the passing of time, and they remain relevant even if they are not necessarily new,
Yes.
remain relevant.
Well, I still remain a big fan of books that, and they're few, books written by people who have actually done the job. Often they're written with ghostwriters or supporting writers, and there's no harm in that. But when I say that the ones I would recommend are few and far between, it's because a lot of them are books written, as it were, like history written by the victors. It's sort of how great I was when I was CEO of wherever. But one that I still recommend, although it's now probably at least 10 years old, I think there has been a reissue, is Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, who was president of Pixar, the animation company. And he tells the story of how to lead the very creative teams that are obviously at the heart of Pixar's success. The book came out just as Pixar was being sold to Disney, and so I think in the reissued version, there's more about the integration, not always smooth, of Pixar into Disney. But what attracted me to that book, apart from the fact that obviously it's immediately relatable to anybody who knows the Pixar movies, is that Catmull has no problem in admitting where things went wrong. And that, of course, is almost more useful than saying everything was great. So that's a book in the management domain that I like and constantly recommend. Amy Edmondson, the Harvard academic, who's best known for psychological safety as and that theory, but also important practice of making sure that people feel safe to speak out about things that are going wrong, is somebody I would always recommend. Her most recent book, The Right Kind of Wrong, about different ways of failing and how to deal with it, was a winner of the FT Business Book of the Year award a couple of years ago, and that as a way of categorizing how to handle errors is extremely valuable, I think, because let's face it, whatever image companies and organizations might project, they are basically the sum of how they deal with things that go wrong. And she has a very useful taxonomy of failure that points out that you can have a basic mistake, might just be carelessness, and that is different from a mistake made while making an adventure into a new area, which might, even if it failed, be worthy of praise. She's a great skeptic of the idea that we should embrace failure wholesale, but she is a fan of thinking through what sort of failure is this? Is it something that, we ought to be praising because it's an example or a symptom of adventure and innovation, or is it something that was a basic mistake that we just need to say, how do we avoid this happening again? And in line with her psychological safety ideas, avoiding laying blame. And then a third area, because we've talked about HR, and by definition, HR is sometimes seen as being a sign of bureaucracy. I very much like the work of Bob Sutton and Huggy Rao, two Stanford professors. They wrote a book a few years ago called Scaling Up Excellence, which is essentially framed as, how do you get bigger? But it's not just a book for small companies trying to become big companies. It's also a book for big companies trying to avoid being overwhelmed by bureaucracy. And what I like about it is that it tells very clearly the story that you can't just say we won't have any bureaucracy. Because if you don't have a structure as you get bigger, your company falls over. And we saw that within recent years with, for example, Uber, which under Travis Kalanick fell into the trap of saying, we're just kind of continually pushing the sort of startup hustling that we used to do. And as a result, it ran into, allegations of bullying and harassment that essentially brought down Kalanick and required a complete kind of overhaul of the company. And that was partly down to the fact, I think, that it had grown very fast without building this, what can be denigrated as bureaucracy, to support the objectives that it was pursuing. So those are three that I think I admire. I mean, one thing that I sometimes think about is that a lot of the books that I read and which we consider for our Business Book of the Year award that I help run and that make the headlines are essentially books from the United States, the UK, and the English-speaking world. We don't see a lot or know a lot as a result, I think, about how leadership is being practiced in the fastest growing areas of the world, Asia and China notably. And that, I think, is going to become a handicap because clearly there is huge success being won by Chinese organizations and by China as an economy. And what we hear about leaders, Chinese leaders, is scant. It's not clear to me that there is a Chinese leadership style, and yet a lot of our management theory and practice and examples come from, admittedly, another huge successful economy, the United States, and to a lesser degree Europe, and a disproportionately low amount of this work is coming out of China, and what does come out may not be entirely trustworthy in the sense that, it's being written again as a sort of in praise of genre. So I might be wrong. Perhaps there's lots of management literature in there in Chinese that I just don't get to see. But the fact that we don't get to see it, I think, is dangerous potentially, because it means that we're missing out on something that could be important for the next century of management practice.
That's an area for you to explore, I think.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. And Andrew, you used to have a team, right? Or you used to lead a team.
Mm-hmm.
And now you've moved into a role that's a little bit hybrid. You're doing, of course, a lot of events, a lot of sessions with Headspring as well. And of course, you continue doing writing. How do you reflect a little bit on your career, on your journey here at the FT? And what did you learn? What things would you have done differently? And what are you looking forward?
So, well, I suppose I would say first about team leadership. What I learned from that period of about a decade when I was leading teams in New York and London was that, first of all, that it was vitally important to do the team leadership part well. And I think this might be not unique to journalism, but it's clearly true of editorial at the FT. We obviously put a high premium on the output, the journalistic output of even quite senior managers. And that becomes the most important thing. And I think this is probably true of knowledge work everywhere. Law firms certainly face this, that, practitioners feel that they're measured, and often are only measured, by the output of what they practice, not by their success in leading teams. And as a result, you end up with, some people promoted to management positions or positions that involve management who don't want to spend time on the management part of it. So I recognized that it was important to be able to lead the team well. And I also recognized, maybe this is why I decided not to push for more senior management positions, that it was really hard work, really draining work. If you're doing it properly, you are always on, and you are working, you are absorbing quite a lot of the energy that is coming from other people's complaints, problems, the need to motivate people and be in that position, almost all the time when you're present with your team, that is draining. And so I recognized that there was hard work there. And that's why I have a lot of respect for people who push through and continue to do those jobs, because I think that's, clearly one element of the important work that's done, and a draining one if not managed properly. So self-management becomes important.
Mm-hmm.
So you asked about, the wider career perspective. I mean, I suppose what I've recognized recently is that, as a team member, probably a senior team member of other people's teams, but also as somebody who's working across a range of different projects, that actually there is an element of leadership within that. How do I exercise from my position as an experienced member of a team running our Book of the Year award, for example, which I've been involved with for 20 years. How do I exercise, without having the team leader title, the knowledge and experience that I have in order to influence people who these days are mostly younger than I am, in the direction that I want? So there is a sort of direction I want to go. So that there is a sort of soft skill there that I think, again, this might be unique to knowledge work in the sense that there are a lot of people with lots of experience who don't have management positions but are still contributing. And it's obviously a challenge then for the actual nominated team leaders. And this goes to a wider question, I suppose, which is, we talked about managers and team leaders and chief executives and even presidents. Increasingly, I think, in a lot of organizations, it's not really about the title that you have any longer. It's about the skills that you bring to the table. And so the critical management question is, how does one bring out the best of the skills that people have? How do you even assemble a team that has the right skills? So rather than saying, I've got to have in the room my chief technology officer, my head of HR, and my chief operations officer for this particular challenge. You say, well, what's the challenge? And who, even the people who aren't in the C level of having chief in front of the name, who are the people here who ought to be in the room, rather than the people who say that they think they should be on basis of their title. And so I'm now one of those people who I suppose does have some skills and knowledge, and I won't say that I want to be in more meetings, but I do sometimes think, well, actually, there are other people who could be in this meeting, have skills that might have been necessary here. And because they didn't have the title, they weren't there.
Are you still learning, though?
Well, I mean, I think I'm in journalism because I enjoy learning new things. I can be excited about a new article and a new way of thinking about things. So from that point of view, yeah, absolutely. I have to tell myself that I can challenge myself to do some different things. One of the reasons I think I've stayed at the FT as long as I have is because the FT did, like all media organizations, go through a period of digital disruption that it's still going through, with now AI thrown into the mix, that made the jobs that I do different. So I think obviously, you can still identify an element of what I do, writing, taking notes, interviewing people, and then producing things that eventually appear still in print. That's still the job I joined to do in 1988. But a lot of the things that I'm doing now are different: podcasting, video, live performance, and varieties of sort of social media and other media around that. So from that point of view, I have organically had to learn lots of new skills on top of the things that I already know how to do.
Mm-hmm. And what is the one thing that you're really interested in at the moment?
Well, I'm doing a lot of CEO interviews at the moment, which is always intriguing. I've got no desire to stop doing those types of, taking advantage of FT access to get to see interesting people. I'm writing up an interview with the CEO of Kodak, which, yes, is still going, who is trying to complete a turnaround there. What I'm really interested in, I think, is just in the future is trying to kind of find different ways to tap new ideas from younger colleagues and people who are interested in the things I'm interested in, but also from others, who have new ideas. Are there new and different ways in which we can bring together people with great ideas and allow them to spark off each other? So I'm increasingly interested in the networks that may not yet exist, or that do exist but haven't been sort of facilitated. And a lot of those exist around FT stuff that already happen. There's the book award, the FT Live conferences that I go to and help organize. But those are all things that I think, in the end, and this is a, AI resistant area, are about networks of human beings having smart ideas. So the more that I can be involved in facilitating that, the more excited I get.
Excellent. Andrew, thank you very much. We've taken a lot of your time, but really appreciate you coming here today. My guest today has been Andrew Hill, Senior Business Writer at the Financial Times. I've been Tiago Kivi, and this has been Learning Rewired from Headspring. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.